The first rule of the galaxy was spoken in whispers, etched not on stone or digital archive, but into the survival instinct of every species that had ever crossed paths with humanity. It was not a law of governance or treaty ratified by the Galactic Council. It was something older, more primal, a truth learned in blood and fire. Never, under any circumstances, lay a hand on human children. The galaxy had seen empires rise and fall, species clash and annihilate one another, borders shift and alliances fracture, but one principle endured untouched. Attack their soldiers, their fleets, even their civilians if one dared, but never harm the young of Earth. Every race had heard of what had happened to those who tried, though the details were sometimes obscured by time, myth, and fear. What remained consistent was the outcome: absolute destruction of those foolish enough to commit the act. To the Galactic Empire, however, this rule was a superstition, a whisper carried by weak-minded races too frightened to confront a predator. The Empire, a sprawling dominion of countless star systems and militarized worlds, saw itself as the pinnacle of evolution and progress. To its leaders, humanity was a minor deathworld species with a flair for dramatics, stubborn enough to survive but incapable of standing against a power as vast as theirs. The rumors of vengeance, of whole fleets erased for harming children, were dismissed as myths invented by humans themselves to shield their vulnerabilities. The Empire had no patience for myths. It had power, fleets, legions, and the arrogance of those who believed themselves immune to consequences. One voice in particular pushed the idea forward, a commander whose ambition outweighed even his arrogance. He had studied humanity from afar, watching their colonies grow, their ships expand into the void. He had seen their resilience, yes, but also their restraint. Humans, he concluded, were a species of posturers, threatening thunder but never delivering lightning. Their so-called history of vengeance was nothing more than propaganda to keep the galaxy wary. He believed he had uncovered their greatest weakness, their children. By striking there, by tearing open the heart of their families, the humans would finally be forced into submission. They would bow to the inevitability of the Empire, and the galaxy would see the so-called deathworlders as just another broken species. The target he chose was not a fortress or a core world, but a research colony nestled at the edge of human space. It was a place not of war, but of peace. The colony thrived on exploration, discovery, and family. It was where scientists raised children among laboratories and gardens, where young minds learned to look at the stars not with fear but with wonder. It was a sanctuary by design, built far from contested regions, its defense fleet minimal and its guardians relaxed. To humanity, it was not a shielded bastion but a promise that there would always be places where their children could grow unburdened by war. That promise was shattered in fire. The Empire's fleet emerged without warning, striking with clinical precision. Orbital bombardments tore into the colony, ripping apart habitats and research stations. The defense ships were annihilated within minutes, not by strategy but sheer overwhelming numbers. The humans on the ground, parents, teachers, scientists, scrambled desperately to protect the young. But against the Empire's will, there was no chance. The children screamed in terror as shelters were breached, as fire fell from the sky, as soldiers stormed through corridors meant for laughter and learning. Some were killed instantly, others dragged away as trophies, proof for the commander that humanity could indeed be broken. He believed he had won, that he had proven the galaxy's first rule to be nothing but a story, but stories have roots, and roots often run deeper than empires understand. Across the galaxy, species watched in silence. Many did not approve of humanity, fearing them as unpredictable and dangerous, but none ever dared to touch their children. The Empire had crossed a line that even the cruelest civilizations avoided. The broadcasts of the Empire's propaganda, images of broken shelters, of weeping survivors, of children's voices silenced, spread quickly, not to intimidate but to horrify. In the great markets and council halls, whispers became a storm. The humans would not let this stand. They never did. And when they acted, it would not be limited to battle. It would be a reckoning, back on Earth and across the scattered colonies. The news arrived not with the blare of alarms but with the cold precision of reports. Families received messages of loss, names of children among the dead. There were no fiery speeches, no immediate outbursts of rage. The humans fell into a silence more terrifying than screams. Their leaders convened in private, their generals waited without word, their scientists set aside experiments. Even the civilians, the countless billions who might normally demand action or justice, said nothing. It was as though an entire species held its breath at once, every heart beating in rhythm to the same grim realization. A line had been crossed, and there would be no return, the Empire celebrated. They believed the human silence was submission, that the lack of retaliation meant fear. They paraded their victory across conquered worlds, declaring that the so-called deathworlders were nothing more than another species who could be cowed. Their fleets sailed proudly, their commanders boasting in council chambers that the myth had been shattered. To them, humanity was already defeated. They mistook silence for surrender, restraint for weakness. They did not understand the human way of war, or the human heart when it came to protecting their young. For humans, history was not just a series of events but a memory etched into culture, carried forward across generations. Their wars on Earth had been waged for survival, for principle, for ambition, but when children were harmed, when innocence was stripped away by force, their wars had turned into something else entirely. The galaxy had not seen it in millennia, not since the last foolhardy species had targeted a human nursery and been erased within a single cycle. The Empire had chosen to ignore that history, believing it exaggerated. They had forgotten that humans were not just a species of warriors, but a species of parents. And a parent's fury is unlike any other. The colony's survivors were evacuated in the aftermath, but many refused to leave the wreckage. They dug through the ruins with bare hands, searching for children who might still live. They carried out tiny bodies wrapped in sheaths, lined them together, and whispered promises over them that their deaths would not go unanswered. Some of the children survived, scarred and silent, their eyes holding the weight of trauma no being should bear. Those survivors became living symbols, their presence a reminder of what the Empire had done, and what humanity must do in return. Entire populations rallied not to abstract causes or strategic goals, but to a singular truth: their children had been attacked. That could not stand. The galaxy held its breath as it watched. Other species remembered their own encounters with humans and chose carefully where they stood. Some feared that aiding the humans would invite destruction alongside the Empire, so they remained silent. Others quietly shifted away from imperial alliances, unwilling to be near the storm that was coming. Old enemies of humanity, who had once fought them bitterly, did not celebrate the Empire's actions. They knew better. They remembered what humans became when their young were threatened, and they wanted no part in what was about to unfold. They too whispered the ancient warning: never touch the children. The Empire's arrogance only deepened. Its leadership declared the humans irrelevant, boasting that they had proven the first rule false. They failed to see the shifting tides, the cracks forming in their alliances, the silent dread spreading across the galaxy. They thought themselves untouchable, blind to the reality that they had awakened not just an enemy but a force of nature. Humanity's silence was not surrender. It was the sharpening of knives, the forging of steel, the gathering of storms. It was the calm before a war the Empire could not imagine, and in that silence, something shifted. Across Earth and its colonies, a collective oath took root, unspoken but undeniable. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no forgiveness. The Empire had broken the first rule. Now humanity would break the Empire. Humanity did not mourn in the way other species expected. There were no wails broadcast across the stars, no demands made to the Galactic Council, no appeals for sympathy from neutral races. Instead, there was silence, an eerie unity that spoke louder than any speech. In homes, families sat together and stared at the names of their children who would never return. In bunkers and war rooms, leaders reviewed data with steady hands. In laboratories, scientists cleared research projects and began reassigning resources. Factories went dark for a moment before roaring back to life, not producing tools of exploration but engines of war. The silence was not grief, it was focus. Humanity had shifted from shock to purpose, and purpose in humans was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The first orders were not for vengeance but for gathering. Veterans who had retired decades earlier reported to stations without needing to be called. Civilians volunteered en masse, flooding recruitment offices until entire city blocks had to be converted into processing centers. Families who had lost children refused to stay behind. They joined logistics lines, offered their homes for billets, turned their grief into labor. The resolve was absolute. Humanity did not see this as a war of politics or territory. They saw it as a matter of survival, as primal as any struggle on the death world that had shaped them. The Empire had taken their young, and now the Empire would cease to exist. Across the galaxy, observers recorded the transformation. They had seen human militaries before, had fought them in smaller wars or skirmishes. But this was different. This was not mobilization for conquest or defense. It was something older, colder, stripped of ambition. Humanity's entire industrial base shifted in days. Civilian ships were retrofitted into war vessels. Research intended for medicine and terraforming was redirected into weapons development. In places where bureaucracies might slow progress, humans bypassed them entirely. Committees dissolved, councils ceded power, leaders gave single commands and were obeyed without question. Unity of purpose was something few galactic species ever achieved, yet humanity achieved it almost overnight. The Empire dismissed these preparations at first. Their propaganda described humans as panicking, throwing everything into a feudal war effort. They spoke of the superiority of imperial fleets, of the inevitability of human defeat. But while they boasted, human operatives were already moving. Small teams infiltrated border outposts, mapping supply lines, disrupting communications, stealing codes. Ships vanished in deep space without record of attack. Mining stations vital to the Empire's logistics suffered catastrophic failures that no engineer could explain. The galaxy began to notice that wherever the humans were silent, something disappeared. They were not broadcasting threats, not proclaiming revenge, they were already enacting it. Other species began to withdraw from the Empire quietly. Trade partners reduced shipments. Allies delayed their fleet commitments. Worlds that once answered imperial commands with obedience suddenly found excuses. The cracks in the facade of imperial supremacy spread rapidly, not because of anything humanity said, but because of what the galaxy remembered. They remembered the stories of what humans became when their children were harmed. They remembered the rumors of fleets burned to ash, of civilizations erased. And they realized those were not myths. They were warnings. For the humans, every detail mattered. Military academies opened their vaults of history, pulling ancient strategies once thought obsolete and adapting them to space warfare. Anthropologists advised on the psychology of fear, teaching commanders how to break not just armies but the will of entire populations. Scientists released projects long kept classified, technologies too dangerous for peacetime, now deemed necessary. Engineers tested weapons that bent the laws of physics, while hackers built viruses that could shred the Empire's communication networks. Farmers increased food production to sustain prolonged campaigns. Even children too young to fight contributed, writing messages for soldiers, collecting supplies, refusing to be idle. The entire species moved as one. In the neutral zones, traders whispered that the humans were no longer human in the ordinary sense. They were something else, an idea, a storm, a force that would not be stopped until it had run its course. The Empire, blind in arrogance, refused to see it. Their commanders believed humanity was still bound by rules of war, by treaties, by logic of survival. They did not understand that humans had left those behind the moment their children were attacked. This was not a war to win. This was a war to erase. The first true retaliation was a whisper compared to what was to come. An imperial fleet stationed at the edge of contested space went silent. Dozens of ships vanished from scanners. No wreckage, no distress calls, no survivors. The Empire declared it a malfunction, a black hole anomaly, anything but human action. Yet when the humans released a single transmission, short and sharp, the illusion collapsed. The transmission showed the commander who had ordered the strike on the colony. He was not alive. His ship was boarded, his breach captured, and his execution broadcast in silence. There were no speeches, no taunts. Only his terrified face as humans ended him, and then darkness. The message was clear. Humanity had begun. Panic spread in the periphery of the empire. Governors demanded more protection, generals called for reinforcements, but resources were stretched thin. Every convoy was a potential target. Every supply line became a liability. The humans struck unpredictably, sometimes with fleets, sometimes with lone operatives, sometimes with sabotage so subtle it left Imperial investigators chasing ghosts. They did not care about taking territory. They cared only about destruction. Systems burned not because they were strategic, but because they had housed those who celebrated the deaths of human children. The pattern was psychological, designed to make the Empire fear every shadow, every silence, every gap in communication. Neutral species watched with growing dread. They saw the Empire bleeding resources and confidence, yet humanity showed no sign of stopping. Entire colonies were being fortified, industries expanding, fleets multiplying. Human unity was relentless. Even their allies, who might have hoped to calm them, chose instead to step aside. They knew nothing could restrain humanity now. Some whispered that it was no longer war but extermination, and the only question left was how long the Empire could survive. The silence of humanity broke only once more, with a transmission sent across every frequency. It did not ask for help, did not threaten, did not justify. It was a statement, delivered in a voice stripped of emotion. You touched our children. We will not stop until the Empire's ash. That was all. The galaxy froze as the words echoed. Empires that once believed themselves mighty reevaluated their defenses. Species that had long dismissed human myths realized they had been warnings carved into history. Even enemies of humanity whispered among themselves, hoping that their own grudges would be forgotten in the shadow of the coming storm. The Empire's leaders, still blind to the scale of what they faced, ordered a full offensive against human colonies. They believed that crushing Earth's outer holdings would break morale. Instead, they found resistance far greater than expected. Human colonies, once peaceful, had transformed into fortresses. Civilian ships armed with improvised weapons tore into fleets. Mines and traps littered space. Guerrilla tactics harassed supply convoys until whole campaigns stalled. Imperial soldiers reported fighting enemies who did not retreat, who fought even when outnumbered, who detonated ships rather than surrender. And worse, the humans captured Imperial soldiers alive, not to torture, but to release them, always with a message burned into their memory. Humanity had not yet begun in earnest. In council chambers across the galaxy, the silence deepened. Species who once mocked humans now feared being near them. They did not debate whether the Empire would fall. They debated how much of it would remain by the time the humans were finished. And some quietly began sending aid to Earth, not out of compassion, but out of fear. Better to stand on the side of humanity than against it. Better to be remembered as allies than as accomplices. The humans themselves did not boast. They did not need to. Their actions spoke louder than any propaganda. Every day the Empire lost ships, worlds, soldiers. Every day humans advanced further, not in lines of conquest but in circles of annihilation. They were not interested in borders. They were interested in erasure. The first rule had been broken, and humanity was fulfilling the consequence that history demanded. The galaxy watched and remembered why the rule had been written in the first place. It was not myth. It was survival. And the Empire had forgotten.